The morning Queen Elizabeth II died, the clocks inside Balmoral Castle seemed to stop with her. The staff moved in hushed steps. The corgis lay flat and quiet on the stone floors. Outside, the Scottish hills sat grey and indifferent under an early September sky, doing nothing to soften what had just happened inside those ancient walls. The world would find out soon enough. But, inside the castle, the knowledge was already spreading from room to room like cold air under a door. The Queen was gone, and everything that had belonged to her was now, in one breath, up for question. Grief in a royal household does not work the way it does in ordinary homes. There is no sitting on the kitchen floor and crying into your hands. There is protocol. There is a chain of command. There is a list of things to be handled before the tears are even fully dry, and somewhere near the top of that list, always, are the jewels. The Queen's jewels were not simply personal possessions the way a grandmother's ring might be. They were history made wearable. They were power given a physical form. They were symbols that had sat on the heads and necks and wrists of women who shaped nations, and whoever controlled them even temporarily held something far bigger than diamonds and gold. Queen Elizabeth had accumulated one of the most extraordinary personal jewelry collections in the world across her 70 years on the throne. Some pieces belonged to the crown, kept in trust for the monarchy and its future rulers. Those were never really hers to give. But others, many others, were deeply, personally hers. Pieces given to her by her parents. Pieces she had worn on her wedding day. Pieces tied to moments that only she remembered. Tiaras that had sat on her head at state dinners, at coronations, at the kind of nights that get written into history books. These were hers in a way that transcended inventory lists and palace ledgers. And, among all of them, there was one that mattered more than most. The lover's knot tiara had a story that stretched back long before Elizabeth wore it. It had been made in 1914 for Queen Mary, Elizabeth's grandmother, a woman whose iron composure and magnificent personal style became the template for what a British queen was supposed to look like. Queen Mary had worn it with the kind of authority that made people understand, without being told, that this was not a woman to be crossed. When she died in 1953, the tiara passed to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth wore it with her own brand of quiet, unshakable dignity. It became associated with her in the way that certain pieces of jewelry become associated with certain women, inseparable, almost like a second face. But the tiara had another chapter in its story, one that made it even more charged by the time Elizabeth died. In the 1980s, Elizabeth had loaned the tiara to Diana. The young Princess of Wales wore it at official engagements, at state dinners, at the kinds of appearances where the cameras never stopped flashing, and she wore it the way Diana wore everything, with a luminous, slightly heartbreaking grace that made people feel she had been born to carry beautiful things. The tiara and Diana became linked in the public imagination. Photographs of her wearing it circulated around the world. When Diana died in 1997, those photographs took on a different weight entirely, the kind of weight that turns objects into relics. Elizabeth had taken the tiara back after Diana's death. She wore it herself again in the years that followed. But its association with Diana never fully faded, and everyone inside the royal family knew it. The tiara was complicated. It was beloved. It was, by the time of Elizabeth's death, one of the most emotionally loaded objects in the entire collection. The question of what happened to it next was never going to be simple. In the days immediately following Elizabeth's death, the royal household moved into the careful, choreographed process of handling the transition. Charles was now king. Camilla was now queen consort. That shift in title carried with it an assumption understood by those around them, even if not yet publicly stated, that certain things which had belonged to the late queen would naturally flow toward the new queen. That was how it worked. That was tradition. Camilla's team began making quiet inquiries. Not demands. Not commands. But inquiries, the kind made by people who expect a particular answer. The lover's knot tiara was on the list. What Camilla's advisors perhaps did not fully calculate was that between the late queen's personal collection and the new queen's access to it stood something unexpected. The Royal Collection Trust, which manages the crown's assets, had protocols. Palace staff had their own loyalties. And then, there was Princess Anne. And the Princess Royal was 72 years old by the time her mother died, and she had spent those 72 years becoming the toughest, most no-nonsense member of the Windsor family by a considerable margin. She had worked harder than almost anyone in the family, taking on more royal engagements per year than most of her relatives combined. She wore sensible shoes and said what she thought and had absolutely no patience for posturing or politics when her mother's legacy was at stake. She had been at Balmoral when Elizabeth died. She had been one of the last people with her. The grief she carried was not the performative grief of public mourning. It was the private, immovable grief of a daughter, and it sat behind her eyes like a stone wall. And knew what her mother's jewelry meant. She had watched her mother wear those pieces across decades. She understood them not as assets to be redistributed but as living pieces of a woman who had just left the world. And she had strong views, very strong views, about what should happen to them. The palace, in the weeks after Elizabeth's death, was quietly tense in the way that large institutions become tense when power is shifting and nobody wants to be the first to say something aloud. Staff members walked carefully. Conversations happened in corridors and, then, stopped when the wrong person walked by. The transition from one monarch to the next was officially seamless. The king is dead, long live the king, but, unofficially, in the human texture of daily life inside those walls, it was anything but smooth. The question of the tiaras sat in the middle of all of it. Camilla had never been universally beloved, and she knew it. She had spent years rehabilitating her public image, slowly and methodically, from the woman the tabloids had cast as the destroyer of Charles and Diana's marriage to the steady, warm presence who had become her husband's most reliable support. It was real work, unglamorous and patient, and it had largely succeeded. By the time Charles became king, Camilla's approval ratings were the highest they had ever been. She was no longer the villain of the story, at least not to most people. But the Diana connection never entirely disappeared. It lived in corners of the internet and in the memories of people who had loved Diana with a fierceness that outlasted her death by decades. And, when whispers began to circulate that Camilla might wear the lover's not tiara, Diana's tiara, as many people still thought of it, those corners got loud very fast. Inside the palace, the atmosphere around the jewelry question was, in the words of people familiar with the situation, delicate. That is a royal word. It means explosive, but everyone is pretending otherwise. And was not pretending otherwise. She had been present for conversations about her mother's collection in the days after Elizabeth's death, and she had made her position clear in the way that and always made things clear, directly, without decoration, with the quiet authority of someone who has never felt the need to raise her voice because she has never doubted that she will be heard. The pieces that had personal significance to her mother should be handled with care. They should not be rushed into new hands. There needed to be thought given to what Elizabeth had intended, what the pieces meant, and what their distribution said about how the family honored her memory. This was not a woman asking for a favor. This was a woman drawing a line. And, somewhere on the other side of that line, a tiara sat in a velvet case, waiting to see what would happen next. The situation that was developing inside Buckingham Palace in the autumn of 2022 was, on its surface, a question about jewelry. But jewelry, in royal families, is never just jewelry. It is inheritance made tangible. It is the physical expression of who matters and who comes next. When a queen dies and her daughter-in-law begins to ascend, every piece that moves from one set of hands to another is a statement about the past and the future and the complicated, often painful space between them. The lover's not tiara was not just a beautiful object. It was a battlefield. And the battle was only beginning. What nobody outside the palace walls fully understood yet was how far Princess Anne was prepared to go. She had watched her mother give her entire life to service, to duty, to the careful stewardship of things that were bigger than any individual. She was not going to watch that legacy get picked over carelessly. She was not going to stand aside while objects of profound personal and historical significance were distributed according to whoever asked loudest or had the most recently acquired title. The tiara would be handled correctly. And would make sure of that, whatever it took. The palace, that autumn, was full of quiet fires. This was the beginning of one of them. The Royal Collection Trust is one of those institutions that most people have never heard of and never think about, which is precisely the way it prefers things. It manages over 1 million objects held in trust by the monarch for the nation: paintings, furniture, manuscripts, armor, porcelain, and jewelry. The crown jewels in the Tower of London are perhaps its most famous holdings, but those are only a fraction of what falls under its jurisdiction. The trust employs conservators, historians, curators, and a small army of administrators who spend their careers cataloging and caring for things that other people will never touch and most will never see in person. When a monarch dies, the trust becomes, briefly, one of the most sensitive places in the entire royal apparatus. Inventories are reviewed. Assets are assessed. Decisions begin to be made carefully, with lawyers present, with an eye on both the legal standing of each piece and its historical significance about what goes where. It is not fast work. It is not meant to be fast work. The slowness is intentional. Rushing the distribution of a dead monarch's possessions is not done, and anyone who tries to hurry the process is, in the trust's institutional culture, regarded with quiet alarm. In the weeks after Queen Elizabeth II's death, the trust was operating under exactly this kind of careful, measured pace. Lists were being compiled. Pieces were being photographed, reassessed, cross-referenced against decades of prior records. Staff were communicative but cautious. Everything moved through proper channels. The problem was that not everyone around the new royal couple was content to wait for proper channels. People close to Camilla, advisors, staff, the kind of courtiers who exist in every palace and whose entire purpose is to advance the interests of their principal, had begun making inquiries that went beyond the gentle and drifted toward the pointed. The lover's knot tiara had not been formally designated as a crown jewel. It had been part of the late Queen's personal collection, which meant its disposition was a matter for the estate and the family, not simply the crown. That distinction was important. It was also, from a certain angle, an opening. The logic being applied, at least in some corners, was straightforward: Camilla was now queen consort. She needed jewels appropriate to that position. The late Queen's personal collection contained pieces that had been worn at state occasions, at royal engagements, at the kind of events Camilla would now be expected to attend in her new role. It made practical sense for her to have access to them. It was not acquisition, it was transition. It was the normal flow of things in a royal household when the baton passed. This logic was not unreasonable on its face. It was, however, deeply unpersuasive to Princess Anne. Anne's position was not driven by any personal hostility to Camilla, though their relationship over the years had been complex in the way that most relationships inside the Windsor family were complex: formally cordial, personally complicated, never quite warm. Anne's objection was more fundamental than personal feeling. Her mother had been precise about her possessions. Elizabeth was a woman who paid attention. She knew what she owned and she knew what it meant, and she had, in the last years of her life, given thought to where things should go. To allow items from her personal collection to simply drift toward whoever was in the most convenient position to receive them was not honoring those wishes. It was overriding them. There was also the matter of Diana. The lover's knot tiara's connection to Diana was not something that could be set aside simply because it was inconvenient. Among the pieces in Elizabeth's personal collection, this one carried the most visible, most publicly understood, most emotionally charged association with the Princess of Wales. Diana had worn it at major appearances. She had been photographed in it hundreds of times. When people thought of the tiara, they thought of Diana. When they thought of Diana wearing it, they felt something, a whole complicated mixture of loss and romance and tragedy that was still very much alive in the public imagination, 25 years after Diana's death. For Camilla to wear it would be, in the eyes of many, a provocation. Not an accidental one. A statement. One that said, the old story is over, this is the new story, and the new story wins. Whether that message was intended or not, it would be received. Anne understood that. She had spent her entire adult life inside the royal family's relationship with the media and with public perception, and she was under no illusions about how this would land. A photograph of Camilla in the lover's knot tiara would detonate across the internet like a depth charge. The Diana faithful would react as if something had been desecrated. The tabloids would write about nothing else for a week. The new king's early months on the throne, already under intense scrutiny, would be clouded by a controversy that was entirely avoidable. and did not want to protect Camilla from embarrassment. She wanted to protect her mother's legacy from being dragged into an entirely unnecessary public fight. And so she acted. The precise nature of how Anne intervened has never been officially confirmed, because these are not the kinds of conversations that get recorded and released to the public. Royal family decisions about inherited possessions happen in rooms where no journalists are present and where discretion is expected of everyone involved. What has been reported, in carefully worded accounts from people described as familiar with the situation, is that Anne made her position known forcefully and early, and that her intervention carried weight that Camilla's advisors had perhaps not anticipated. Anne had a particular kind of authority within the family that was different from formal power. She did not have Charles's title. She did not have William's position in the line of succession. But she had something else. She was Elizabeth's daughter. Not a daughter-in-law. Not someone who had come into the family through marriage. She was the blood, the direct line, the person who had grown up in those palaces and learned from that woman and understood, more intimately than almost anyone else alive, what her mother valued and what she had intended. When Anne spoke about what should happen to Elizabeth's possessions, she was not speaking as a peripheral figure making a request. She was speaking as the primary keeper of her mother's wishes, and she spoke accordingly. She had done her homework. She knew which pieces had been worn by whom and when. She knew the history of the lovers, not Tiara, not just its public history, but the private, familial history that existed around it. She knew that her mother had strong feelings about Diana's memory and had never been fully comfortable with how that chapter of the family's story had been handled by the public and the media. She knew that Elizabeth had, in her own quiet way, maintained a respect for what Diana had represented, even amid all the difficulties of those years. To allow Diana's most publicly associated tiara to be passed to Camilla without careful thought, without consideration of what it meant, without any acknowledgement of the weight it carried, that was not something Anne was going to permit without a fight. The fight, such as it was, happened out of public view. There were no shouted arguments in marble corridors. There was no dramatic confrontation in the throne room. What happened was quieter, more institutional, more characteristic of how things actually work inside the royal family. Conversations were had, positions were stated, and the people responsible for managing the late Queen's estate began to understand that any path that led to Camilla wearing the lover's not tiara in the near term was going to run directly into Princess Anne, and Princess Anne was not moving. The Royal Collection Trust, navigating between the interests of the new king and queen, the stated preferences of the Princess Royal, and their own protocols for handling sensitive transitions, took the path that institutions under this kind of pressure typically take. They slowed down. The tiara was not transferred. It was not allocated. It was noted as a piece requiring further consideration, which in palace language meant, "This is too contested to touch right now," and "We are going to leave it exactly where it is until the temperature drops." For Camilla's advisors, this was not the answer they had been working toward. The inquiries had been made. The logic had been laid out. The case, from their perspective, was reasonable. And yet the tiara was staying put. The reason it was staying put, though no official statement was ever issued to this effect, was Anne. Her intervention had been effective not because she had formal authority over the collection but because she had something more durable. She was right, and the people around her knew it. The lover's not tiara was complicated. Moving it to Camilla quickly was a mistake waiting to happen. The sensible thing, the thing that protected everyone, including Camilla herself, was to leave it alone for the time being. Whether Camilla and her team fully understood the dynamics of what had just happened is uncertain. Whether they appreciated Anne's intervention, even indirectly, is even less certain. The relationship between Camilla and Anne had its own history, its own undercurrents, its own silences that spoke louder than anything either woman had publicly said about the other. But the tiara stayed in its case. And the palace moved on to other things, the way the palace always does, carrying its quiet fires from one room to the next without ever letting them show on its face. Outside, the world had moved on to the spectacle of the new reign. There were proclamations and ceremonies and a coronation to plan. The public had not yet heard the tiara story. To most people, the transition of the crown had been solemn, dignified, and seamless. Inside, in the particular velvet-lined quiet where the lover's not tiara sat untouched, things were considerably more complicated. And was not finished yet, there is a kind of authority that does not announce itself. It does not issue press releases or hold press conferences. It does not send strongly worded letters or post on social media or give carefully orchestrated interviews to sympathetic journalists. It simply exists, dense and unmovable, and everyone in the room feels it without being able to say precisely where it is coming from. Princess Anne had that kind of authority in abundance, and she had been building it for 50 years. Her record spoke before she did. Since the 1970s, she had worked at a pace that made most of her relatives look leisurely by comparison. She had attended more official engagements per year than any other member of the royal family for decades running, and she had done it without complaint, without drama, without ever appearing to expect credit for the effort. She had competed in the Olympic Games as an equestrian. She had been the victim of a kidnapping attempt in 1974 and had responded to it with a coolness that became famous when her attacker demanded she come with him. She reportedly told him, flatly, that she didn't think he was going to make it. She had raised 2 children largely out of the spotlight. She had built schools and hospitals and supported hundreds of charitable causes without ever needing the cameras to follow her. She was, in short, the kind of person whose opinion carries the specific gravity of a life fully and seriously lived. Within the royal family, Anne occupied a unique position in the aftermath of her mother's death. Charles was consumed with the enormous task of becoming king, the audiences, the ceremonies, the constitutional duties, the constant public scrutiny that attaches itself to a new monarch in a way it never quite attaches to an heir. William was preparing for his own eventual succession, navigating his relationship with the media, managing a young family through an enormous transition. Harry was in California, watching from a distance that had grown wider and more contested with every passing month. And was the one who was simply present. She was at Balmoral when Elizabeth died. She accompanied her mother's coffin on the journey from Scotland to London. She stood vigil. She did what needed to be done, quietly and completely, the way she had always done everything. And, in the weeks that followed, as the family settled into the shape of the new reign, she was there, consistent, reliable, paying attention in the way that only people who truly love what they are protecting ever pay attention. The jewelry question was still unresolved. The lover's knot tiara had not been formally allocated, had not been transferred, had not been placed in anyone's inventory as belonging to a new owner. It sat in the administrative middle distance of the late Queen's estate, technically pending, practically untouched. But pending is not the same as settled, and knew that the situation would not remain in suspension indefinitely. Estates were processed. Inventories were finalized. At some point, decisions would be made, and if she was not actively engaged in shaping those decisions, they would be made by other people according to other priorities. She began to make her case in the most effective way available to her, through the detailed, documented, historically grounded articulation of what these pieces meant. And had grown up watching her mother wear jewelry in a way that most people do not experience. She had not merely observed the pieces from a distance, as the public did, she had been in the room. She had watched her mother choose which tiara to wear for which occasion and understood the reasoning behind those choices. She knew that Elizabeth approached her jewelry the way she approached everything else, with precision, with care, and with a deep awareness of what each piece communicated. The lover's knot tiara was not simply beautiful. It was a conversation. Its long history, Queen Mary, then Elizabeth, then Diana, made it one of the most layered pieces in the entire collection. Each woman who wore it had carried something of the women before her into the room, whether she wanted to or not. The tiara was, in this sense, more than an heirloom. It was an ongoing story about what the royal women of Britain had been and what they had endured. And made the argument that this story deserved respect. That its next chapter should not be written carelessly, by whoever happened to be in the most convenient position to receive it. That the piece needed to remain where it was, honored and protected, until the question of what to do with it could be considered with the full weight of its history taken into account. She also made a more personal argument, one that cut closer to the bone. Her mother had never made a formal bequest of the tiara to Camilla. Elizabeth had, in the years before her death, given careful thought to her possessions. She had given jewelry to people she loved and trusted. She had made specific, personal gifts that reflected her genuine wishes. The lover's knot tiara was not among the pieces she had designated for the new queen consort. That absence was meaningful. It was not an oversight. Elizabeth did not overlook things, and pressed this point. Quietly, firmly, in the way she pressed all points, not with the hot urgency of someone fighting for personal gain, but with the steady, measured insistence of someone who knows they are right and is prepared to keep saying so until the right people hear it. The people responsible for processing the estate began to understand that there was a genuine question here, not merely a sentimental objection from a grieving daughter. The legal and institutional structure around royal inheritances is complex, but, at its center is always an effort to honor what the deceased intended. If there was real uncertainty about what Elizabeth had intended with respect to this piece, and was making the case that there was then, moving quickly was not just insensitive, it was potentially inappropriate. Elsewhere in the palace, the machinery of the new reign was generating its own pressures and complications. Charles was working to establish his monarchy in the early months, a process that was attended by enormous goodwill but also by constant media attention and the inevitable comparisons to his mother. Camilla was finding her footing as queen consort, making public appearances, adjusting to the demands of a role that was in some ways larger than she had expected. The world was watching them both very closely. Against this backdrop, the tiara question was a small fire compared to the larger ones burning around it. But small fires, left unattended, have a way of growing. Wotton understood, and what she suspected some of those around the new couple did not fully appreciate, was that the public's emotional investment in Diana's memory had not diminished with time. If anything, the passage of years had clarified and intensified it. Diana had become a kind of cultural saint, a figure of beauty and vulnerability and tragic fate who occupied a permanent place in the imaginations of millions of people who had never met her. Every object associated with her had acquired a sanctity that was entirely real in its social and emotional effects, even if it had no legal standing. The lover's knot tiara was the most visible, the most photographed, the most publicly associated of those objects. A photograph of Camilla wearing it would not be received as a simple image of the queen consort in a piece from the royal collection. It would be received as an act. A taking. A replacement. The internet would burn for days. And was not protecting Diana's legacy out of personal feeling for her sister-in-law, toward whom her emotions had always been mixed. She was protecting the new king's reign from an unnecessary wound. She was protecting the institution she had served her entire life from a misstep that would generate controversy and distress for no good reason, because no good reason existed for moving so quickly on a piece so charged. Her intervention had already slowed the process. Now she was working to make it permanent, or at least lasting. She raised the question of whether the tiara should remain in the royal collection, available for future use by the family but not assigned as anyone's personal possession. This was not an unprecedented arrangement. Several pieces moved between different members of the family on loan arrangements, worn at specific occasions and then returned. Making the lover's knot tiara part of this system rather than allocating it to an individual would preserve its availability without resolving the charged question of ownership in a way that would cause public damage. The suggestion was not immediately accepted. But it was not dismissed either. The estate administrators and the trust officials were, by this point, genuinely uncertain about the right path forward. The piece was valuable, historically significant, and contested within the family in a way that made any simple allocation risky. Anne's alternative, a kind of protective holding pattern, had at least the virtue of avoiding a mistake. They took it under consideration. And waited. She was very good at waiting. It was, in many ways, the skill most central to her character, the ability to hold a position with complete steadiness for as long as required, without wavering, without performing impatience, without showing any sign that the waiting cost her anything. It was the same quality that had made her such an effective royal. She committed to what she believed in and she stayed committed, regardless of how long it took for the world to catch up. The tiara remained in its case. The autumn turned to winter. The coronation was being planned for the following spring. The world moved through its seasons, and, inside the palace, the quiet fires continued to burn, and the velvet case continued to sit where it was, and the question of what happened next had not yet been answered. But, the question of who was asking it had been settled. And was asking it. And was going to keep asking it until the answer was right. King Charles III coronation took place on the 6th of May, 2023, inside Westminster Abbey, under the weight of nearly 1,000 years of accumulated ceremony and the eyes of a global television audience that numbered in the hundreds of millions. It was the first coronation in 70 years. Everything about it had been planned down to the last second, the last candle, the last note of music. The gold of the regalia caught the light in the abbey the way it always had, throwing its reflections across the faces of the congregation, turning ordinary people briefly luminous in its borrowed shine. Camilla sat in the abbey in the Queen's chair. She was crowned alongside her husband. She wore the Queen Mary's crown, a piece of formal regalia appropriate to the occasion, her expression composed, her bearing correct. She looked like what she was, a woman who had arrived at the most significant moment of her life with her nerves fully under control, because control was something she had learned to wear like a second skin. She did not wear the lover's knot tiara. The tiara had not appeared on any official document associated with the coronation preparations. It had not been photographed on Camilla at any of the events leading up to the ceremony. It had not been allocated, transferred, or formally designated. It remained where it had been for months, in careful custody, unassigned, sitting in the particular kind of silence that follows a battle that has been won without ever being publicly acknowledged as a battle. And attended the coronation in her full ceremonial dress, among the most senior members of the procession, her presence carrying the specific weight of someone who has lived inside this institution long enough to understand every layer of every gesture. She was, as she always was at these occasions, precise and contained, her emotions kept behind the surface she presented to the world. Nobody watching the ceremony would have known, from looking at her, what she had spent the previous 8 months quietly fighting for. But, the people inside the palace knew. The story of the Tiara Standoff, as it came to be known in certain carefully worded reports in the British press, began to leak out in fragments over the following months. No official confirmation was ever issued. The palace does not comment on these matters, and the people involved are not in the habit of giving accounts of internal family disputes to journalists. What emerged did so through the particular, imprecise channel of royal reporting, sources described as close to the situation, people familiar with the discussions, insiders who could not be named but whose accounts were consistent enough across different outlets to suggest they were drawing on the same reality. The picture that assembled itself from these fragments was this: in the weeks after Elizabeth's death, there had been an expectation, in certain quarters around the new queen consort, that the lover's knot tiara would move toward Camilla as part of the natural redistribution of the late queen's personal jewelry. That expectation had been met with a significant and early intervention from Princess Anne, who had made clear, through the channels available to her, which included direct conversations with estate administrators and trust officials, as well as the simple, immovable fact of her position as the late Queen's daughter, that this was not going to happen without a much more thorough consideration of what was appropriate. That intervention had worked. The tiara had not gone to Camilla. It had remained in a kind of institutional custody, its future still formally undetermined, but, its near-term story settled, it would not be seen on the head of the new queen consort in the first months or years of the new reign. Whatever happened to it eventually, that particular chapter had been closed. The public's reaction, when pieces of this story began to circulate, was revealing. The response was not primarily about royalist politics or constitutional questions. It was almost entirely emotional. Diana's name appeared in nearly every discussion of the tiara. The photographs of Diana wearing it were reshared across social media by people who were, in many cases, too young to have been alive when they were taken. The grief for Diana, which had never fully resolved itself in the public imagination, reasserted itself through the story of a piece of jewelry. This was precisely what Anne had anticipated. She had not been wrong about the public's emotional state. The people who covered the story, and the people who read it and responded to it online, confirmed every calculation she had made. A photograph of Camilla wearing the lover's knot tiara in the early days of the new reign would have been a detonation. Not because of anything Camilla had done wrong. Not because the transfer would have been illegal or even necessarily inappropriate by any strict formal measure. But, because of what it would have meant in the emotional language that the public used to process the royal family's story, and that language was still, 25 years after Diana's death, written in terms that made the tiara untouchable. and had read the room correctly. She almost always did. The question of Anne's motivations is one that resists simple answers, because Anne herself resists simple answers. She is not a person who explains herself. She does not give interviews about her feelings or write memoirs about her inner life. She exists in the public record primarily through her actions, and her work, and her actions, taken together, over a lifetime, describe a woman whose relationship with her family and her institution is conducted entirely through duty, through service, through the kind of love that expresses itself in protection rather than sentiment. She had not defended the lover's knot tiara because she wanted it for herself. She had no known interest in wearing it. She had not intervened because she bore Camilla a specific and targeted resentment, though their relationship was complicated in ways that the family would never discuss publicly. She had acted because she believed it was wrong for the peace to move as quickly as certain people were pushing for, and because she was in a position to say so, and because nobody else who was in a position to say so was saying it. That was a very and kind of reason. What the situation revealed, more broadly, was something about the texture of power inside the royal family in the months following Elizabeth's death. The transition from one monarch to another had been smooth in its public presentation. Charles had ascended without constitutional difficulty. Camilla had taken her place beside him. The machinery of the monarchy had continued to operate as it always had, producing its ceremonies and its statements and its photographs of officially smiling people. But, underneath that smooth surface, the family was working out the same thing every family works out when its central figure disappears: who are we now, and who gets to decide what we keep? The jewelry question was, in this sense, a proxy for something much larger. It was a question about memory and loyalty and what it meant to inherit not just objects but the stories attached to them. Elizabeth had been, for her entire adult life, the center of gravity around which everything else orbited. Her presence had stabilized the family in the way that strong central presences stabilize things, by providing a point of reference that everyone understood and could navigate by. With her gone, that gravitational center was absent, and the family was still finding out what it meant to move without it. And was finding out by doing what she always did: working, protecting, paying attention, refusing to let the things that mattered be handled carelessly. It was a role she had not been assigned and had not asked for. It was simply the role that the situation required, and she had filled it the way she filled every role she ever took on, completely, without complaint, and without any apparent need to be thanked for it. The lover's knot tiara sits, as of this writing, in the royal collection, its future still officially undetermined. There are photographs of it in the archives, Queen Mary wearing it, serious and magnificent, in the early 20th century. Elizabeth wearing it, her expression carrying the particular quality of a woman who has learned to hold enormous weight with perfect stillness. Diana wearing it, her eyes doing something complicated with the camera that they always did, inviting and evasive at once. These photographs are a kind of genealogy, a record of women who carried something precious and difficult through their lives. Whether it is ever worn again, and by whom, remains an open question. Royal collections move across generations in ways that are rarely straightforward, rarely free of the emotional weight accumulated over decades of use. The piece will eventually find its next chapter. These things always do. But the chapter that might have been written, the rushed, contested, publicly explosive chapter that would have planted a photograph of Camilla in Diana's tiara into the first months of a new reign, still raw with grief and still vibrating with the unfinished business of the past, the chapter did not get written. Because a woman who never needed credit for anything made sure that it didn't. The coronation was over. The new king and queen had been crowned. The cameras had recorded it all, and the images had been broadcast to the world, and the abbey had been ceremonially emptied, and the long, ordinary work of a new reign had begun. Anne walked out of Westminster Abbey in her ceremonial uniform, her face revealing nothing, as it always revealed nothing. She had done what needed doing. It had worked. That was enough. The tiara was safe. Her mother's legacy was, in this small but real way, protected. And the quiet fires in the palace burned a little lower than they had before.